The Galactic Council mocked humanity until the human scientists rebuilt their sun. The ambient temperature within the council observation deck was regulated to the exact, uncomfortable 75 degrees required for optimal Xylosian comfort, a subtle, constant reminder to the human delegates that this environment was not built for them. Dr. 30 Alcaraz felt the air as a dry synthetic sheath against his skin, a stark contrast to the volatile, superheated plasma fields he was about to enter. He stood perfectly still, his powerful frame encased in the specialized dark blue and black combat-engineered research suit, the Sunforge armor. The armor was designed to withstand the stellar core, but right now it felt like a steel cage against the overwhelming xenophobic scrutiny. Around him stood the assembled representatives of the Galactic Council, dominated by the Xylosians. They were tall, slender figures, their smooth, pink skin covered by robes of pale gray, their faces serene, yet utterly devoid of respect. 30's pale gray eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept across the arc of observers. He was the solution to their impending, civilization-ending crisis, the collapse of their star, Sol Invictus. Yet they regarded him with the patronizing disdain reserved for a clever but dangerous pest. Ambassador Varlik, the Xylosian lead delegate, a creature whose voice was a high-pitched, resonant rasp, inclined his head slightly, an action 30 recognized not as respect but as a calculated physical expression of superiority. Human 30 Alcaraz, Varlik rasped, his eyes narrow slits of violet. The Council grants you permission to attempt the stabilization. Let it be clear, this Sunforge protocol is viewed as reckless and unnecessary by 93% of our stellar engineers. Your technology is considered crude, your understanding of stellar mechanics, opportunistic. 30 did not shift. He did not speak. He let the silence hang heavy, a calculated vacuum into which Varlik poured more poison. You will adhere strictly to the parameters set forth in the Xylosian Core Safety Mandate 77 Sigma, Varlik continued, a note of triumph entering his tone. The Anvil, the vessel provided for your insertion, is equipped with Xylosian regulators. All core adjustments must be approved by the accompanying council envoy, Commander Soriano, who holds the absolute abort authority. Failure to comply, Dr. Alcaraz, will result not just in the loss of Sol Invictus, but in the immediate total revocation of the human sector's colonization charters. The threat was the point. They wanted him to fail, or at least to be thoroughly and publicly humiliated in his success. A few steps behind Varlik, Commander Beatrice Soriano moved. She was not in armor, but in the sleek, charcoal-gray uniform of the Human Interstellar Diplomatic Corps. Her tall, athletic figure held a tension 30 understood immediately, the precise, controlled readiness of someone who had spent years fighting subtle, political battles. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the clean lines of her strong jaw and the fierce intelligence in her intense amber-brown eyes. She was the human face of the Council's compliance, and 30 knew her position was a trap, designed to split humanity's loyalty. Beatrice met 30's gaze for a second, her expression professionally neutral, but the minute tightening around her mouth told him everything he needed to know about her internal fury. She hated this arrangement as much as he did. Varlik dismissed them with a flick of a slender three-fingered hand. The Anvil awaits you in Bay Gamma 6. Proceed. 30 spun on his heel and walked out of the observation chamber, his armored boots echoing loudly on the polished plasteel floor, a defiant sound that broke the Xylosian silence. Beatrice followed, her steps silent and disciplined, catching up to him only when they were alone in the long access corridor leading to the docking bay. 30, she said, her voice a low, precise instrument, avoiding the titles required by council protocol. Beatrice, he replied, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection. He did not slow his pace. You heard Varlik, she said, her tone professional, clipped. The abort authority is non-negotiable. Everything I do aboard the Anvil is logged and monitored directly by the Xylosian High Command. I am their safety lock. He stopped then, turning his full, armored bulk toward her. The air in the corridor seemed to shrink. You are their hostage, Beatrice. And the vessel they gave us? The Anvil? It's 2 decades out of service, a stripped-down hull with minimal shielding. They want me to fail before I even reach the photosphere. I know the specs, she countered, her shoulders squaring. My job is to ensure you navigate their rules without giving them the political ammunition to crush the human sector. That includes following the security protocol right now. She stepped closer, the sharp scent of her synthetic uniform and the subtle, clean musk of her skin filling the space between them. Mandate 77 Sigma requires a full physical and technical inspection before launch. I have to do this. 30 stood impassive, a monolith of muscle and steel. He knew this was another humiliation, but he saw the tension in her hands, the way her eyes held a spark of challenge that went beyond mere duty. Proceed, Commander, he said, his voice flat. Beatrice's amber-brown eyes narrowed, and she began the search with cold, deliberate efficiency, her hands precise instruments trained to find threats. She started with the exterior suit panels, running her sensitive fingertips along the armored seams, searching for unauthorized devices. When she moved to his chest plate, her gloved hands pressed firmly against the heavy plating over his heart. Any unauthorized modifications to the conduit access ports? She asked, her voice low. Standard diagnostic enhancements, 30 replied, his posture unchanged. He felt the firm pressure of her hands, strong, controlled, yet undeniably there. She shifted her focus to the sealed helmet coupling near his neck, her touch necessarily becoming more intimate as she leaned in. She was close enough now for him to feel the subtle warmth radiating from her body. Her breath hitched slightly as her fingers brushed the sensitive skin just below the armored collar. The sheer kinetic power contained within his body, emphasized by the rigid suit, was palpable even through the layers of fabric and ceramic. This is not necessary, 30 stated, his voice a low, rough edge. It is mandatory, Beatrice countered, her focus absolute. Her eyes momentarily lifted to his, and the professional mask cracked, revealing a flash of something intense, annoyance perhaps, or maybe a dangerous shared recognition. She moved quickly down his arms, her inspection brief but thorough, until she reached his wrist. She paused, her fingers closing around the thick gauntlet joint. This was the hand that would hold the complex, glowing blue technological device of the Sunforge, the key to their salvation. Beatrice looked up again, their gazes locking in the narrow space. 30. The Xylosians have armed the abort sequence with a kinetic inhibitor keyed to my biometric signature. If you try to bypass me, it will paralyze the suit, and we will both burn. He held her gaze, his pale gray eyes like polished flint. Understood, Commander. Then you will ensure you are never put in a position where you feel you must use it. He watched the brief flare of heat in her amber eyes, an acknowledgement that he had seen past her duty to the defiant spirit underneath. The unspoken truth hung between them. They were partners in this cage, regardless of the mandates. With a final, sharp nod that acknowledged his warning, Beatrice stepped back. The vessel is prepared. We launch in 3 minutes. The Anvil was waiting in the bay, a small, dark vessel, truly insufficient for a core run, a deliberate insult built into its very structure. As they walked the final steps, 30 knew the Council's mockery was only beginning. But he also knew that Beatrice Soriano, for all her protocols, was no longer just the Council's envoy. She was the one human standing between his genius and their destruction. 30 stepped onto the boarding ramp, the weight of the suit and the fate of Sol Invictus resting on his shoulders, his core device held securely. Beatrice followed, securing the ramp behind them, sealing them into the metal tomb that was also the cockpit of humanity's greatest triumph. The Anvil was a cramped metal coffin, its internal architecture cold, utilitarian, and designed for function over comfort, or, more accurately, designed to fail under extreme stress. 30, now settled into the pilot's cradle, felt the vessel shudder violently as the magnetic tow cables released them into the upper chromosphere of Sol Invictus. The external viewports, reinforced with layers of carbon lattice shielding, immediately flared with the blinding, deep orange light of the solar plasma. External temperature reading exceeding projected safety threshold by 1800 degrees Celsius. Beatrice's voice cut across the cockpit comms, professional and precise. She sat in the co-pilot seat, her console screen awash of alarming red indicators. The Xylosian thermal regulators are failing to compensate for the stellar decay volatility. The decay isn't uniform, Commander, 30 said, his hands moving quickly over the manual override controls. He bypassed the Xylosian-installed restrictive navigation lockouts with a fluid, practiced ease. It's spastic. The instability is throwing massive, unpredictable coronal ejections. The Xylosian engineers used a linear decay model. They assumed their star was polite. It's a star, Dr. Alcaraz, Beatrice countered, her tone sharp. They expected thermodynamics, not personality. Thermodynamics in a dead state is predictable, 30 retorted, pulling the controls back hard. The anvil groaned in protest as he slammed them into a tight, unreal trajectory, skimming the volatile edge of a magnetic firestorm. This is a system fighting its own death. It requires a brute force approach, not gentle coaxing. The immediate consequence of his maneuver was severe. A monstrous coronal mass ejection, shaped like a fiery sickle, tore past the port side. The ship's internal gravity compensators screamed and then failed completely. Text, G-force. GG 8-part text. 30 was slammed backward into his cradle, the suit's inertia dampeners engaging with a painful jolt. Beatrice was thrown forward, crying out once as her head slammed against the console's padded hood. Beatrice! 30's voice was instantly raw, stripped of professional distance. She gasped, pulling herself upright with the focused strength of her core muscles. I'm operational. Systems report catastrophic failure on main junction conduit Delta 4. We just lost 40% of our stabilization capacity. The junction is behind your seat, under the main floor panel, 30 snapped, fighting the intense pressure that felt like granite crushing his ribs. I need you to bypass the coolant lines and reroute power from the secondary environmental buffer. Do it now, or we break up. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She wrestled the floor panel open. The atmosphere immediately grew thick and hot as steam vented from the broken conduit. She was working blind, relying purely on muscle memory and the terse, shouted instructions. 30 barked at her through the comms. The extreme G-forces and system failures had forced them into an involuntary physical synergy. She was relying entirely on his piloting to keep the hull from rupturing, and he was relying on her strength and training to keep their life support from failing. I can't reach the manual bypass valve, Beatrice grunted, struggling against the inertial weight pressing her into the floor. Her fingers scraped uselessly against the hot metal. You have to, 30 insisted, his voice strained. Get leverage, use your legs against the seat back. She shifted, pressing her back against the pilot's cradle, her body arching and straining with effort. Her foot inadvertently braced against the thick ceramic housing of 30's armored thigh. The contact was brief, accidental, and completely charged. In the middle of the violent, shaking, dying star, the intimate pressure of her boot against his leg was a raw, immediate connection. It was a recognition of shared purpose and a sudden, unwelcome awareness of the powerful musculature contained beneath the uniform and the armor. Got it, she yelled triumphantly, the valve turning with a screech of tortured metal. The venting steam subsided instantly. Reroute complete, 30 confirmed, pulling the anvil back into a stable, if still harrowing, vector. The G-forces slowly dropped to a tolerable level. He took 3 deep, ragged breaths, the suit's life support humming. Beatrice slowly pulled herself back into her seat, sweat plastering strands of dark hair to her temples. She didn't look at him, staring instead at the green confirmation light on her console. But her chest rose and fell rapidly beneath the sleek fabric of her uniform. That was outside the Xylosian safety envelope by a factor of 6, Dr. Alcaraz, she said, her voice shaking slightly, not from fear, but adrenaline. The Xylosians have created a safety envelope that guarantees failure, Commander, 30 replied, his tone cooling back to professional distance, but the shared moment still vibrated in the air between them. They built a beautiful cage. I just had to push the ship past the certified limits they intended to impose. He paused, then added in a lower voice, Your hands are burned. Beatrice glanced down at the angry red marks blooming on her knuckles from the hot metal. Minor. I've handled worse during training exercises. Training exercises don't usually involve a collapsing F-class star and a hull failure, 30 noted. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a recognition of her competence, which, in his estimation, was a higher form of respect. They plunged further into the star's atmosphere, the light outside darkening into a turbulent, muddy red. The core, the ultimate destination, was a cold, dim void at the center of the chaos. "I need to isolate the core injection system," 30 stated, switching to a new sequence. "The Xylosian comms line runs directly through the primary diagnostic loop. If they try to veto the conduit activation sequence, we lose the window." The Xylosian Core Safety Mandate 77 Sigma requires real-time telemetry and approval from Ambassador Varlic for all pre-core operations, Beatrice recited automatically, folding her hands tightly in her lap. 30 looked at her, his pale gray eyes drilling into her. "And the mandate also assumes the Xylosians designed a vessel capable of surviving the journey. They haven't. I need 20 minutes of comms silence to run a system flush and align the conduits properly. If I ask Varlic for permission, the star will collapse while he's still composing his bureaucratic response." Beatrice stared at the view screen, which now showed the star's dying core as a shifting, magnetic shadow. She was silent for a long moment, the conflict playing out in the taut lines of her body. Her job was protocol. Her instinct, honed by the shared violence of the descent, was survival and the success of the mission. She reached out, her finger hovering over a small, unlabeled switch on her console, the direct physical override for the Xylosian comms lock. 20 minutes, Dr. Alcaraz," she said, her voice barely a whisper, an act of insubordination that could end her career. "If I don't hear absolute confirmation of successful isolation by then, I reconnect the feed, regardless of your progress." She slammed her finger down on the switch. The console immediately flashed an angry red Community Link Error warning. The cockpit instantly went silent, except for the internal hum of the anvil's life support and the deep, persistent, unsettling shudder of the unstable star outside. 30's lips curved slightly, a ghost of a predatory smile. It was the first human, unguarded emotion she had seen from him. 20 minutes, Commander," he agreed, turning back to his work. He knew she had just chosen him and the mission over the Council. That was all the confirmation he needed. The isolation was a relief, but the silence felt heavier than the pressure of the stellar mass around them. The anvil had successfully transitioned into the dead zone, the region immediately surrounding the star's collapsed core, a vacuum of energy starved of fusion. 30 began the meticulous work of prepping the quantum-entangled plasma conduits, the device from the image currently resting in a sterile containment cradle behind their seats. He was entirely focused, his large armored body moving with a surprising, economical grace within the tight confines of the research bay. Beatrice watched him, ostensibly monitoring the anvil's rapidly draining power reserves, but in reality, her attention was wholly on the man who had just risked both their lives with casual audacity. 30 pulled open a panel on the conduit cradle. The conduits themselves were housed within a containment sphere made of an engineered shimmering blue material. He reached in, his fingers, even in the heavy gauntlets, manipulating microconnectors with precision. He was an architect of the cosmos, reducing a star's life and death to a solvable engineering problem. The comms silence stretched into 10 minutes. Beatrice finally stood, needing to move, needing to displace the intense building pressure. She walked the 3 steps to the back wall of the bay, pulling down a small cleaning station to address the residue left by the earlier coolant leak. "Why the anvil?" she asked, her voice low. "If the Xylosians truly wanted this to work, they would have given us a cruiser, something capable of withstanding the energy fluctuations." 30 glanced over his shoulder, his pale gray eyes meeting hers. He didn't stop working. "They gave us the anvil because it was the only hull mass they could fit Xylosian regulators onto without extensive modification. They needed to control the process, not facilitate it." He paused, a tiny, almost invisible wire held between the thumb and forefinger of his armored glove. "But they also gave us a clean slate. No unnecessary tech. A ship designed to be pushed to its absolute breaking point without unnecessary safety nets. It suits me." "And what suits you, Dr. Alcaraz?" Beatrice asked, moving closer, her curiosity outweighing her professional reserve. "Risk? Defiance? You could be leading the Human Stellar Institute right now, safely lecturing on theoretical astrophysics. Why are you 30 seconds from the core of a dying star in a glorified tugboat? He connected the wire and the cradle glowed momentarily, a faint blue light emanating from the conduits. He let out a slow, heavy breath. I took this mission because the Galactic Council believes stellar architecture is the exclusive domain of species who have existed for millennia. They believe that humanity, only 3 centuries past its planet-bound conflicts, is too young, too messy, too emotional to understand cosmic forces. He turned fully now, resting his elbow on the cradle, his proximity immediately overwhelming the small space. And they are wrong. We are messy, we are emotional, and that's why we understand chaotic systems better than the Xylosians and their predictable algebra. We didn't evolve past risk, we learned to exploit it. And this star, Sol Invictus, is the perfect opportunity to shove that messy human truth down their arrogant throats. His intensity was a physical force, tightening the air around them. Beatrice felt a sudden, profound rush of admiration that went beyond respect for his intellect. It was a raw, visceral attraction to his singular focus and defiant purpose. "You're doing this for spite, then," she whispered, crossing her arms tightly, trying to maintain her distance. "I'm doing this for proof," 30 corrected. "And I'm doing it because I like building things that shouldn't exist." He reached out, his gauntleted hand raising slowly. Beatrice flinched internally, expecting a sudden, demanding touch. Instead, he simply adjusted the thin, high collar of her uniform, where the comms strap had slipped during the G-force spike. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second on the delicate skin of her neck, right below her ear. It was an accidental echo of the inspection from Part 1, but this time it was deliberate, intimate, and entirely sensual. The pale gray of his eyes darkened, holding hers captive. The look was not professional. It was purely, deeply male, acknowledging the charged space they had created. "The strain on your throat muscles is visible, Commander," he murmured, his voice now lower, rougher. "You've been bracing for hours. You need to relax." His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a current of heat through her that had nothing to do with the external stellar temperature. Beatrice swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to lean into the contact. "My purpose is to remain focused, Doctor." "Focus does not preclude awareness, Beatrice," he countered, his gaze sweeping over her face, reading the flush beneath her skin, the slight tremor in her hands. "We are entirely alone inside the gravitational influence of a failing stellar body. We are sharing the same pressure, the same risk, and soon, the same heat. Trying to pretend we are still standing on a diplomatic floor is inefficient." He let his hand drop, the immense power of his armor now an oppressive, alluring proximity. "The life support system has redundant sleeping bays, but only one primary research station," 30 continued, stepping slightly closer. "I will be working for the next 24 hours. You will need to rest." "I'll take the secondary bay," Beatrice said quickly, her voice a little breathless. 30 shook his head slowly. "The secondary bay has a compromised environmental seal. You repair what you broke, but I need to make sure the fix holds. You will use the primary station. It is here." He indicated the heavily padded single resting area built into the side of the cockpit wall. A cushioned niche barely large enough for one person to lie down comfortably. It was positioned directly beside the pilot's cradle, within arm's reach of him. "You will be monitored, and I will be working 3 feet from your head," he stated, his pale eyes challenging her to object. Beatrice looked at the small space, then back at 30's immense, commanding presence. His proposal was professional in name only. In practice, it ensured an undeniable, constant, intimate proximity. It was a test of trust and submission to the reality of their shared danger. She finally nodded, acknowledging the necessity and the sensual undercurrent. "Understood, Dr. Alcaraz. I will take the primary station." 30 gave a curt nod of satisfaction, the ghost of his smile returning. "Good. Now, the final system flush begins. I need you to confirm the external pressure readings one last time. We are entering the point of no return." Beatrice immediately returned to her console, the sensual tension now layered beneath a renewed professional focus. But she knew that in the cold, silent depths of the stellar core, their boundaries had dissolved irrevocably. The anvil had settled into orbit around the dead core, its external hull absorbing a chaotic mix of intense radiation and residual stellar energy. The environment was physically and emotionally draining. 30 worked continuously, his armored figure a silhouette against the shifting red light of the star's atmosphere visible through the viewport. Beatrice monitored the vessel's failing integrity, the pressure outside now so extreme that the hull plates groaned and stressed with alarming frequency. The primary research station, the small padded niche, had become Beatrice's confined world. She had attempted to rest, but the combination of the star's unsettling noise, 30's hyper-focused proximity, and the escalating anxiety made sleep unimaginable. He was oblivious to her proximity, yet acutely aware of her presence. 30's concentration was absolute. He moved with the minimal gestures required, his breath loud and steady over the comms loop he used for internal suit diagnostics. External pressure spike 400 kilopascals, Beatrice called out, her voice tight, having been watching the gauge climb for the last hour. Compensating manually, 30 muttered, barely glancing away from the conduit cradle. The Xylosian pressure systems are compensating too slowly. They are designed for gradual fluctuations, not this constant, near-critical stress. It's a design intended to bleed us dry. She sat up, resting her elbows on her knees. I've flagged the hull stress 3 times. Why not report it to Varlic? It proves the anvil is insufficient. 30 scoffed, a deep, humorless sound. Varlic will attribute the stress to reckless piloting. They are listening, Beatrice. They want me to waste time arguing bureaucratic physics while the star collapses. He rose, stretching his massive frame, the movement consuming the small cockpit. The sheer scale of the man within the armor was intimidating. He grabbed a maintenance toolkit and moved toward a junction box near her station, needing to fix a fluctuating power coupling. His movement forced her to press herself back against the wall of the niche to give him space. The connection is right here, beneath your station, 30 said, his voice low. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably, pulling her legs up. 30 knelt down beside her, the heat radiating off his armor, a contained energy that felt like a low, persistent fever. He worked with his head mere inches from her hip, the concentration lines etched into his face visible in the dim light. I'm picking up an anomalous energy signature in the conduit materials, 30 said, switching topics, his voice a focused rumble. It's subtle. Not enough to stop the Sunforge, but it's inconsistent with the alloy I specified. He pulled a small, shielded spectral analyzer from his wrist sheath and ran it over the shimmering blue containment cradle. The results flashed on a microscreen visible only to him. Tell me what you see, Beatrice insisted, leaning forward slightly to try and peer past his shoulder. I see trace elements of a rapidly degrading alloy, 30 said, his voice tightening with sudden, cold realization. It's Xylosian standard, but only used for non-critical, atmospheric containment, not stellar core incision. He quickly cross-referenced the signature with the original schematics Varlic had approved. His lips pulled back in a grimace. This is not an accident, Beatrice, 30 stated, his voice now dangerously quiet. The core is already starved of fusion elements. When the Sunforge activates, it requires the conduits to withstand the maximum counterpressure of the stellar mass fighting for equilibrium. My specified material, titanium trellis, has a failure threshold of 1.22 petapascals. This substitute alloy has a failure threshold of 0.4 petapascals. He looked up at her, his pale gray eyes blazing with controlled rage. It will fail 30 seconds after insertion. It won't just fail to reignite the star. It will cause a catastrophic runaway core decay, destroying the star and taking the anvil with it. They gave me a bomb, not a tool. Beatrice sucked in a sharp breath. The implication was staggering. They planned for the failure? But why? Their civilization depends on this star. Not failure, 30 corrected, pushing himself to his feet, his posture radiating a dangerous, contained fury. They planned for my failure. They calculated the risk, assuming that when Sol Invictus began its final collapse, they could step in as saviors, armed with the evidence that human technology is too volatile and seize all human sector patents on stellar architecture when they were eventually forced to beg for our real help. He began rapidly inputting new sequences, trying to model a compensation strategy. I tried to flag this anomaly when I ran the spectral analysis outside the core, but they dismissed it as paranoia. Now, we are too deep to retreat and replace the conduit. The window for stabilization is closing. The shock of the deliberate, cosmic-level betrayal was profound. Beatrice felt the cold certainty of their shared doom settle in her stomach, and "I must inform the human sector immediately," she said, scrambling for the comms override button she had locked in Part 2. "They need to know about the sabotage." "No," 30 commanded, grabbing her wrist with a hand encased in the heavy armor. His grip was absolute, paralyzing. "If you break the comms silence now, Varlik's pre-programmed safety lock will engage. It will immediately paralyze the anvil and trigger the conduit injection sequence. We won't even have 30 seconds to react." He pulled her arm toward him, holding her wrist against the polished ceramic of his chest plate. "We are trapped, Beatrice. The Council planned this to the second. They know exactly when the window for the Sunforge is closing, and they know that to save the star I must execute the injection sequence regardless of the danger. They believe I am too arrogant to abort." He released her wrist but maintained the close proximity, his intense gaze never leaving hers. The adrenaline, the exhaustion, and the sudden, terrifying certainty of shared betrayal stripped away the last veneer of their professional distance. "We have 15 minutes until the window closes," 30 whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "I cannot risk bypassing the injection manually. The field exposure is lethal even in this armor." Beatrice stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and the searing intensity of their confinement. The heat from his body, the desperate situation, and the profound violation of trust coalesced into a raw, electric charge between them. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gripped the metal of his chest plate. It was not a gesture of aggression, but of profound, defiant need. She could feel the relentless power of his body beneath the armor, the heartbeat of the man who had just risked everything for a species that hated him. "Show me the override sequence for the paralysis lock," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "I need to know how to disable it if we reach the final second." 30 did not speak. He simply lifted his hand, placed a gauntleted finger on her console, and showed her the single, complex sequence, the secret key that opposed the Council's trap. In that moment, surrounded by the crushing gravity of the dying star, their professional relationship died, and something infinitely more dangerous and passionate was born. They were conspirators, lovers, and rebels, bound by the Council's imminent, calculated betrayal. The air in the anvil was so thick with tension and heat that it felt combustible. The counter was ticking down, 12 minutes until the optimum injection window closed. 30 was running frantic simulations, attempting to find a buffer that could compensate for the known catastrophic failure point of the substituted xylosian alloy. Nothing worked. "The failure is structural, Beatrice," 30 said, his voice flat with the weight of inevitability. "Once the fusion begins, the conduit will vaporize from the internal pressure. We need a manual deep-core stabilizer injection, something smaller, less complex, that can be positioned precisely." He looked at the device resting in the cradle, the main, complex conduit pictured in the image, and then reached into a sealed armory compartment. He pulled out a slender, segmented rod of pure or human-engineered titanium trellis. It was a research probe, not a stabilizer, but it was made of the correct, resilient material. "This probe," 30 explained, holding the rod up, "I can prime it with a low-yield quantum charge. If I insert it directly into the stellar magnetic nexus before the main conduit ignition, it might create a momentary protective field that prevents the main conduit's immediate collapse. It buys us maybe 3 seconds." Beatrice immediately understood the danger. But that requires a direct, unprotected exposure to the core's magnetic field. Even in your armor, it will overload your life support and fry your central nervous system. "The only way to execute the manual insertion is outside the hull," 30 confirmed, pulling the segmented rod back into a sheath. He began sealing the internal research bay, preparing for depressurization. The anvil is too large to get close enough. Suddenly, the silent cockpit crackled. A prioritized, coded message bypassing the firewall Beatrice had enacted flashed on her console. It wasn't from Varlik, but from a lower-level Xylosian data technician. Text, priority alert. High-value data sequence intercepted. De-encrypting. Beatrice leaned in, reading the rapid scroll of alien script. It was a communication between Varlik and the Xylosian High Command, time-stamped 5 hours ago, detailing the failure of the Anvil's oxygen scrubbers and concluding with the phrase, "The human vessel is disposable. Mission success is not required, only the proof of their technical arrogance." It was the final, undeniable evidence of intentional, structural sabotage and the willingness to sacrifice 2 human lives. A cold, determined resolve settled over Beatrice. Her professional mask vanished, replaced by a fierce primal protection of her species and the man beside her. 30, wait, she said, her voice shaking with restrained violence. They didn't just sabotage the conduit. I just intercepted a low-priority, encoded confirmation they knew the Anvil's scrubbers were compromised. They intended for us to die from hypoxia before the star even claimed us. She reached over and decisively slammed her hand down on the comms override button she had locked in Part 2, re-locking it so the Council could not break in. She then rapidly punched in the complex sequence for the paralysis lock override that 30 had shown her in Part 4. The lock disengaged with a silent internal click. "The paralysis lock is disabled," she announced, her amber eyes burning. "They cannot stop us from the outside. We have to do this, 30. We have to beat them." 30 stopped his preparations, turning slowly to face her. His posture shifted from focus to one of lethal, absolute commitment. He saw the fire in her eyes, the complete mutual commitment to rebellion. "If the magnetic field doesn't kill me, the radiation will," 30 stated, his voice devoid of doubt, only strategy. "I need to enter and exit the core field in under 30 seconds. I need you to run the fusion trigger from the cradle the second the probe is stabilized. Do you understand?" No hesitation. "I understand," she confirmed, her jaw tight. "But you are not doing this alone." 30 frowned, shaking his head. "Beatrice, this requires precision and singular focus." "No," she interrupted, cutting him off with a force that surprised them both. She unbuckled her diplomatic corps uniform jacket, the heavy fabric falling away, revealing the sleek, form-fitting composite underlayer. "You need 30 seconds. If you are struggling with the magnetic pull, I need to be external, attached to the hull, running a localized counter-frequency from my suit's deflection sheath to buy you that micro-margin of time. I am not trained in astrophysics, but I am trained in close-quarter defense and hull stabilization. We are in this together." The sheer audacity of her defiance, the absolute trust she placed in his genius, and the shared recognition of their enemy was the most powerful, visceral turn-on he had ever experienced. The countdown timer on the main console flashed 3 minutes to injection window. 30 strode toward her, the sound of his armored boots heavy and decisive. He reached out and gripped her face gently, his large gauntlet framing her head, his fingers barely brushing her hair. His pale eyes were dark with a mixture of desperate need and crushing certainty. "We might not come back, Beatrice," he whispered, the truth of their imminent death heavy in the air. "Then we go out defying them," she replied, lifting her chin, her amber eyes reflecting the internal light of the dying star outside. "I would rather burn in the core with you than live on the Council's terms." She closed the distance between them, ignoring the cold, hard ceramic of his faceplate, and pressed her mouth against the visor, a fierce, desperate kiss against the glass. 30 let out a sound, a deep, animalistic groan of raw need that reverberated through his suit. He pulled her flush against the armored mass of his body, crushing her to his chest. His unyielding pressure was a physical declaration of possession and absolute trust. He tilted his helmet, their connection becoming a profound, agonizingly brief physical moment of connection, a shared recognition of their defiance and the intense passion that had been building in the confinement. He pulled back, his breath ragged. "Get into the EVA suit, Commander. We have 90 seconds." The moment was gone, replaced by lethal focus. They moved with the synchronized, fluid efficiency of partners who had already transcended the need for words. They knew their mission had just changed from a rescue to an act of war. They were going to rebuild the sun, not for the Council, but as a monument to human defiance. The interior lights of the anvil turned stark red, signaling immediate depressurization. 60 seconds. Beatrice moved into the secondary airlock, pulling on her own streamlined EVA suit, charcoal gray, slightly lighter and more flexible than 30's heavy Sunforge armor. She connected her suit comms directly to his internal network, bypassing the standard council-mandated frequency. Suit integrity nominal. Beatrice's voice was crisp, adrenaline-laced. 30, already suited, his armor glowing faintly with contained energy, attached the segmented titanium trellis probe to a docking port on his left forearm. He looked like an implacable dark knight preparing for a cosmic battle. 30 seconds, 30 confirmed. I'm manually cycling the outer airlock. Brace for 0G and extreme magnetic drag. The outer hatch cycled open with a heavy thud, exposing them to the raw, turbulent stellar core. The view was horrifyingly beautiful. A vast, collapsing sphere of muddy red plasma laced with chaotic, shifting magnetic field lines that looked like invisible, deadly cobwebs. 30 stepped onto the hull, his magnetic boots locking down instantly. Beatrice followed, securing her position on the starboard side. The sheer heat radiating from the core was intense, even through the advanced plating of the suits. Commander, you focus solely on the deflection sheath, 30 commanded, his voice a low, urgent static in her ear. I need you to generate a localized counter-frequency to the magnetic drag, 180 degrees opposite my vector. It buys me milliseconds, but I need them. Understood. Counter-frequency calibrated, Beatrice confirmed, her body tensing as she activated the experimental systems in her suit. She could feel the enormous, invisible force of the star's magnetic field attempting to tear her away. 30 detached himself from the hull, firing his maneuvering thrusters toward the heart of the magnetic turbulence, the specific chaotic nexus point where the probe had to be inserted. Entering the field now, 30 grunted. Immediately, the raw magnetic drag seized his armor. His powerful body, designed for stellar density, was instantly fighting against a force of cosmic magnitude. The strain was audible in his ragged breathing over the comms. Our text, wash, magnetic drag, propto, frac, socias, text, field strength, ash text, our conductivity. Drag resistance failing, 30 gasped. I can't maintain the vector. The star is pulling me off course. Beatrice, watching his trajectory drift violently, pushed the counter-frequency of her deflection sheath to maximum overload, pouring all her suit's auxiliary power into the shield. She could feel the agonizing strain in her own suit as the counterforce tried to stabilize his position. Hold 30, I'm fighting it, she yelled. Her muscles locked tight beneath the suit, the mental exertion of maintaining the precise counter-frequency immense. She was using sheer, protective will to anchor him against the collapsing magnetic field. Suddenly, a series of rapid, low-yield kinetic impacts hammered the anvil's hull near Beatrice. We have incoming targets, Beatrice shouted. Small, non-reflective debris. No, they're Xylosian defense satellites. They are firing at our position disguised as errant stellar debris. The Council, seeing the paralysis lock had failed, and recognizing their manual EVA, had resorted to open hostility. They are trying to kill the conduit before I insert it, 30 realized, his voice sharp with focus. They're aiming for the probe on my arm. A sharp, searing impact struck 30's armored shoulder. His suit bucked violently. Damage report, Beatrice demanded, fighting the magnetic drag and the kinetic impacts simultaneously. Minor plating breach, life support nominal, but my targeting systems are compromised, 30 replied, his movement becoming jerky and difficult. You won't be able to achieve the required micrometric precision for the nexus point, Beatrice stated instantly, prioritizing the mission. She knew exactly what she had to do. 30, detach the probe, she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. I will stabilize the vector. You are now the guidance system. She disengaged her boots from the hull, relying only on her suit's thrusters and her practiced physical control. She flew toward his struggling form, closing the distance quickly. 30, trusting her implicitly, detached the slender, segmented rod, the titanium trellis probe, and held it steady in his gloved hand. Beatrice grasped his free hand, linking their two bodies into one kinetic mass. Her superior external thrusters and her focus on the magnetic counterfrequency could now compensate for his trajectory. "I am your anchor, 30, Beatrice said, her voice a fierce whisper. "Tell me where to pull. Guide us to the nexus." "Pull hard 10 degrees down, 9 o'clock, 30 directed, his pale eyes searching for the precise moment, the exact opening in the stellar chaos. Beatrice used every ounce of her training, the physical exertion blurring into an intense, desperate dance. She was flying his weight, his inertia, and his lethal payload toward a goal that was invisible to her, trusting his sight and his genius implicitly. Another kinetic impact struck the back of 30's armor, but this time Beatrice, shifting their connected bodies, used her own lighter hull plating to shield his armored back from the direct impact on the probe arm. The protective act was visceral, a total submission to their partnership. "We are 1 second away," 30 suddenly announced, his voice tight. "The nexus is visible. It's a microfracture in the magnetic lines. Now, Beatrice, hold me steady. Absolute zero movement." Beatrice braced, locking her thrusters and holding their connected mass with a desperate, crushing intensity. She could feel the immense raw power of 30's body pressed against hers through the armored suits, the physical manifestation of their shared defiance. 30 plunged the titanium trellis probe into the heart of the stellar collapse. A blinding blue light erupted from the nexus, momentarily overwhelming the external sensors. The titanium trellis probe was stable, creating a momentary protective counterfield, a human needle inserted into a cosmic wound. "Probe stabilized," 30 roared triumphantly. "Mission accomplished, Commander. Now, get us back to the anvil." The counterfield gave them the necessary seconds. Beatrice, physically exhausted but exhilarated, fired her thrusters backward, dragging 30's armor, laden with the heavy main conduit, back toward the small, dark vessel waiting in the deadly gloom. They had challenged the Council, the Star, and the limitations of their own bodies. Beatrice dragged 30 through the outer airlock hatch the moment they crossed the hull line, feeling like an immense final release of pressure. The internal repressurization cycle began immediately, a hissing sound that was the sweetest music they had ever heard. 30, fusion sequence, Beatrice gasped, peeling off her helmet the moment the internal environmental controls stabilized. Her dark hair was slick with sweat, her face flushed with adrenaline. 30, already on his knees, was accessing the main conduit cradle. "Activating the Sun Forge now. Stand clear, the initial surge will be violent." He ran his hand over the control panel. He had a brief window to initiate the fusion sequence while the titanium trellis probe held the magnetic field open. He punched the final command. The anvil was immediately subjected to a force that dwarfed the earlier G-force spike. It wasn't a physical battering, but a massive seismic vibration that shook the vessel to its core. Outside the viewport, the entire visible star shifted its color from an angry, muddy red to a fierce, almost agonizing white. The Xylosian comms line, which Beatrice had locked, suddenly screamed with static, followed by the frantic, high-pitched voice of Ambassador Varlic, his carefully modulated composure entirely gone. "Human, abort immediately. You are destabilizing the core. You will cause a supernova. Abort!" 30 ignored the scream. He watched the conduit cradle's diagnostics, his pale gray eyes locked on the fluctuating pressure gauge. The Xylosian alloy was already showing stress fractures under the immense pressure of the initial fusion reaction. "The Xylosian material is degrading at 50% capacity," 30 said, his voice a tight, low rasp. "The counterfield from the probe is buying us time, but it's melting itself down to do it. The main fusion reaction has to stabilize the conduit now." Beatrice, her own suit now off, stood bracing herself against the wall, watching the viewport. The star's roar was no longer just visible, it was a physical feeling, a deep, continuous vibration that settled in her bones. 30 was fighting the star itself, injecting the precise quantum signature needed to achieve a controlled, localized stellar fusion event, the Sun Forge. Suddenly, the roaring intensified. The light outside went from white to a brilliant, life-giving yellow-orange. The turbulent plasma stabilized, coiling around the central conduits like an immense, fiery vortex. The gauge on 30's console held steady. "Success," 30 whispered, the single word heavy with exhaustion and triumph. "Fusion stabilized. Sol Invictus is regenerating." The entire cockpit fell silent again, save for the triumphant, steady hum of the anvil's life support, now drawing clean power from the revitalized star. 30 leaned back against the pilot's cradle, his body slack with the sudden, crushing release of tension. He looked completely spent, his strong jaw set, his breathing heavy. Beatrice moved to him instantly, her concern for his exhaustion eclipsing all professional decorum. She didn't speak. She simply knelt beside him and reached out, pulling the heavy, restrictive helmet from his head. His hair was matted to his forehead, his face streaked with sweat and soot from the compromised internal seals during the EVA. He looked rough, primal, and impossibly beautiful in his triumph. 30, she murmured, her hand reaching up to touch the dark stubble on his cheek. He closed his eyes for a long moment, savoring the feel of her cool, soft skin against his roughened face. He reached up and enclosed her hand with his own. "We did it," he said, his voice thick. "We did it," Beatrice confirmed, the victory shared between them, intimate and total. The danger of the mission, the shared act of defiance, the desperate coupling of their bodies in the external field, it all coalesced into a need that transcended the professional or the emotional. It was a raw, physical hunger born from confronting death together and winning. 30 reached out with his other hand, drawing her forward until her body was resting fully against the broad, armored front of his suit. The ceramic was still warm from the stellar radiation, radiating a deep, comforting heat. "You shielded me," 30 whispered, his voice catching. "You challenged the council for me." Beatrice pressed her face into his neck, inhaling the specific, clean, masculine scent of him. Sweat, ionized air from the burnt wires, and something fundamentally him. "I fought them for humanity, 30, she corrected, lifting her head, her amber eyes blazing with passion. "And for the man who was audacious enough to teach a star how to live again." She leaned down, finally connecting her lips to his. The kiss was everything the last few hours had promised. Desperate, demanding, and overwhelming. It was not a gentle exploration. It was a hungry consumption, a shared relief that bordered on violence. 30's free hand wrapped around her back, pulling her tight against the armor with a possessive, crushing strength that made her gasp. Beatrice moved to disengage from the suit, needing skin-to-skin contact, needing to feel the power beneath the layers of engineered ceramic. 30 broke the kiss, his eyes fiercely locked on hers. He moved his large hand, his fingers working the suit's internal locking mechanisms. The heavy plate of his chest and abdomen split with a hiss of released pressure. He pushed the pieces outward, revealing the sleek, damp, powerful contours of his own body beneath the primary underlayer. "The primary research station," 30 murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly command. "Now!" Beatrice needed no further instruction. She moved out of the cradle, pulling him with her, and into the cramped, padded niche. The entire vessel was shaking with the triumphant roar of the star outside, the perfect cosmic celebration of their successful defiance. They shed the remaining layers of their composite underlayers in a frantic tangle of heat and desperate relief, their bodies finally meeting in the confined space, a raw, primal expression of survival, victory, and utter commitment. The star they had just saved raged outside, its bright, healing light bathing the cockpit in a fierce, life-affirming glow. The anvil was now a silent cocoon, floating in the stable, revitalized light of Sol Invictus. The external view was a breathtaking sight of controlled, self-sustaining fusion, the fiery yellow-orange light of a star reborn. Inside, the primary research station, designed for rest, had become the site of a profound, exhausted intimacy. Beatrice lay pressed tightly against 30, both of them wrapped in a single thermal blanket they had managed to retrieve. The proximity was no longer a consequence of danger, but a deliberate choice. 30's hand rested heavily on her hip, his touch possessive and grounding. His pale gray eyes were open, staring at the newly stabilized star. He looked entirely different now, the ruthless scientist replaced by a man deeply, physically satisfied. "They're still watching, you know," Beatrice murmured, her voice husky, her cheek resting against the powerful curve of his shoulder. Varlick's comms broke through, demanding we abort. "They're recording everything that happens from this moment on, hoping for a sign of technical fault or human arrogance they can use." "Let them watch," 30 said, his voice a low, rough vibration in his chest. They will see proof of human genius, and they will see the consequence of their political foolishness. He sat up slowly, the movement controlled despite his fatigue. The muscles across his back and shoulders flexed beneath his damp skin, a testament to the immense physical strain of the EVA. We need to gather the evidence of their sabotage, 30 stated, his focus snapping back to the political war ahead. The conduit alloy, the intercepted comms. We can't just rely on the Sunforge's success, we need to dismantle their power structure entirely. Beatrice rose with him, pulling on a clean internal layer suit. Her movements were fluid, disciplined, but the way her eyes kept locking onto 30 betrayed the depth of their new, sensual bond. They worked meticulously, their movements synchronized, the non-verbal cues they used more intimate than any conversation. 30 collected the spectral data from the shattered Xylosian alloy conduit, the bomb they had successfully disarmed and turned into evidence. Beatrice, using her diplomatic training, secured the time-stamped log of Varlik's frenzied abort demands, alongside the earlier intercepted message about the compromised oxygen scrubbers. As 30 examined the data, he leaned against the console, his proximity to Beatrice a silent, constant acknowledgement of their commitment. The structural integrity of Sol Invictus is stabilizing at 98.7%, 30 noted, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. The Xylosian engineers will spend a century trying to reverse engineer the titanium trellis counterfield. They'll find nothing. The quantum signature is keyed to my sequence and the alloy is synthesized exclusively on Earth. Their reliance on bureaucracy and deceit cost them everything, Beatrice observed, securing the evidence in an encrypted diplomatic lockbox. They saw a chance to seize technical superiority and risked their entire civilization. That is not the behavior of a sophisticated species, 30. It's desperation. 30 straightened, placing his hand gently on the back of Beatrice's neck, his fingers stroking the sensitive skin beneath her dark hair. It was a lingering, possessive touch, a silent declaration that this victory was shared and sealed between them. Their superiority complex has always been their weakness, 30 said, his voice dropping low. They think intelligence must be cold and emotionless. They mock our passion, our volatility, our audacity. They fail to understand that those traits are precisely what allow us to innovate when their rigid systems fail. He turned her to face him, the small movement bringing their bodies close. The silence of the anvil was punctuated only by the steady hum of the regenerated star's energy. Commander Soriano, 30 murmured, his pale eyes searching hers. You were assigned to be my jailer, my diplomatic leash. You chose to be my partner in defiance. Beatrice lifted her hand and traced the strong line of his jaw. I chose the man who would rather face the collapse of a stellar core than submit to arrogance. The Xylosians believe human diplomacy is about subservience. I will teach them that human diplomacy is about strength, integrity, and the defense of our own. The raw intensity of the moment was overwhelming. The shared recognition of their commitment was cemented by a deep, lingering kiss that was far gentler than the one that followed the fusion, yet infinitely more meaningful. It was a promise built not on fleeting passion, but on absolute, shared purpose. A warning light flashed on the console, the signal that the Xylosian Council Station was preparing to hail them. Showtime, Beatrice said, her voice steady and resolute. She stepped back, straightening her uniform layer. Varlik will be waiting to seize control of the narrative. We will not give him the chance. 30 nodded, his lips curving into a confident, almost predatory smile. He moved to the pilot's cradle, activating the comms system. Let the Council witness humanity's ascendancy, he said, his voice now strong and clear, ready for the confrontation. The anvil began its slow ascent out of the core zone, carrying not just the successful Sunforge protocol, but the damning evidence that would shatter the Xylosian-dominated Council's authority forever. The anvil docked at the Xylosian Council Station under heavy armed escort, a final, petulant gesture of control from the embarrassed Council. As 30 and Beatrice disembarked, the atmosphere in the sterile, brightly lit docking bay was frigid, thick with unspoken hostility. 30, now wearing his dark blue and black armor again, walked with an unshakable confidence, the weight of his success and the evidence against them, making him the most dangerous man in the sector. Beatrice, clad in her formal diplomatic uniform, walked shoulder to shoulder with him, her posture a defiant, unified front. Ambassador Varlik waited at the entrance to the bay, flanked by a dozen senior Xylosian delegates, the pink-skinned figures in pale robes. Varlik's composure was back, a fragile shield of arrogance barely concealing his fury. "Dr. Alcaraz," Varlik hissed, his voice reedy with contempt. "You are ordered to submit to a full review of your flight data immediately. Your reckless improvisation nearly destroyed Sol Invictus." "Ambassador," 30 interrupted, his voice calm, cutting through Varlik's attempt at dominance. "The review is unnecessary. Sol Invictus is stabilized and operating at optimum fusion capacity, a feat your engineering corps deemed impossible for centuries." Varlik stepped closer, his slender form trembling slightly. "Your unauthorized deviation from the 77 Sigma mandate, including the unapproved deployment of the secondary probe and the disabling of Commander Soriano's authority, constitutes an act of sabotage. Commander Soriano, you are relieved of duty pending court-martial." Beatrice stepped forward, placing herself deliberately in front of 30, her eyes locking Varlik's violet gaze. "Ambassador, I did not disable the kinetic inhibitor. I acted on the information contained within your own security data, which I now possess. That data proves that the Xylosian alloy substituted into the main conduit, the key component for the Sunforge, was intentionally designed for failure, with a catastrophic failure threshold of 0.4 petapascals. It was a bomb, Ambassador, not a tool." The Xylosian delegates gasped audibly, their pale faces shifting to expressions of shocked denial. Varlik's composure cracked entirely. "Lies! Human deception! Your so-called probe destroyed your structural integrity." 30 reached into the encrypted lockbox Beatrice carried and produced the spectral analysis report, projected onto the massive docking bay screen. The data was undeniable, the molecular signature of the inferior, substandard alloy. "We found this after the successful stabilization, Ambassador," 30 said, his voice like cold steel. "The conduit did not fail because of my methods. It failed because of your malice. The only reason your civilization still exists is because Commander Soriano risked her life to defy your attempt to murder us and discredit humanity." He then projected the low-priority encoded message Beatrice had intercepted, the one confirming the compromised oxygen scrubbers. "And this," 30 continued, his voice heavy with righteous condemnation, "this is the proof that you deliberately ensured the Anvil's life support would fail, condemning us before we even reached the core. Your intention was not rescue, but assassination and intellectual theft." The political earthquake was instantaneous and devastating. The Xylosian delegates began whispering frantically, their ranks dissolving in chaos. Varlik was cornered, his authority evaporating in the light of his species' shame. His eyes were wide with panic. "This is fabrication. Forgery. The Council will never accept human evidence." "The Council already knows," Beatrice stated, delivering the final, cutting indictment with cold, diplomatic precision. "My report, complete with all spectral and telemetry evidence, was transmitted to the human sector diplomatic fleet the moment we stabilized the star. That report has been disseminated to every neutral species in the Galactic Council, including the Qatar and the Raelon Collective, who suffered similar technical failures on their own stellar projects." The implication was clear. The conspiracy was exposed, and the truth was already galaxy-wide. 30 stepped forward, towering over Varlik, his dark armor a physical manifestation of human superiority and defiance. "You mocked us, Ambassador," 30 said, his voice low and dangerous. "You saw humanity as small, emotional, and technically crude. But our crude solution has saved your son, and our integrity has exposed your corruption." He looked past Varlik to the assembled delegates. "The human sector hereby demands a full, independent inquiry into the governance of the Galactic Council. We do not require your acknowledgement of our genius, but you will respect our ascendancy, and you will fear our response to betrayal." Varlik, defeated and humiliated, could only manage a choked, pathetic noise. He knew the collapse of Xylosian authority had just begun. He turned on his heel, his robes trailing behind him, leading his delegation in a chaotic, silent retreat from the bay. Beatrice watched them go, a single sharp breath of triumph escaping her lips. She turned to 30, her eyes shining with pride and devotion. "The Xylosian rule is over. 30, she said, her voice ringing with finality. He reached out and took her hand, his large armored fingers closing over hers, a seamless bond of scientist and diplomat, genius and protector. 6 months had passed since the successful rebuilding of Sol Invictus and the ensuing political fallout. The Xylosian-dominated Galactic Council had fractured. The Qatar, the Raylon, and several other long-marginalized species, armed with the evidence of Xylosian sabotage, demanded and received full autonomy. Humanity, far from being revoked, was now positioned as the moral and technical authority in the galactic sector. 30 Alcaraz was no longer just a scientist. He was an intergalactic hero, a reluctantly acknowledged figurehead for human excellence, perpetually avoiding the council committees that now desperately sought his counsel on everything from stellar mechanics to ethical governance. They were aboard a human diplomatic vessel, the Icarus, charting a course back toward Earth space. The cabin was spacious and luxurious, a complete contrast to the cramped, hostile confines of the Anvil. Beatrice was at the primary command console, coordinating the handover of the captured Xylosian data to the new interim council structure. She wore a deep emerald green uniform now, signifying her promotion to the human sector's lead diplomatic envoy. Her stature, already formidable, had grown in the wake of the triumph. "The Qatar are formally requesting the schematics for the titanium trellis probe," Beatrice announced, without turning around. "They're offering a full trade treaty, including access to the Beta Centauri resource cluster, in exchange." 30 was sitting in a plush leather chair near the viewport, sketching complex energy diagrams on a transparent data slate. He looked relaxed, but still possessed the sharp, intense energy that defined him. "Tell the Qatar the alloy is not for trade," 30 replied, his pale gray eyes fixed on the distant starfield. "It's a demonstration of our capacity, not a commodity. Offer them a 10-year non-disclosure agreement on the Sunforge protocol in exchange for access to the Beta Centauri cluster. We build their star back up. They pay us in sovereignty, not currency." Beatrice smiled, a quiet, satisfied curve of her lips. She recognized the strategy. Humanity offered empowerment, not dependence. She finished the transmission and stood, walking toward 30. She stood over him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. The formality of the council was a distant memory. Their relationship was one of total, passionate equality and shared command. "The new council delegation wants to hold a summit on Earth," Beatrice informed him, her thumbs pressing gently into the knots in his neck muscles. "They want to see the home of the species that defied cosmic law." "Let them come," 30 said, closing his data slate. He reached up, his large, powerful hands wrapping around her wrists. He pulled them down, holding her hands against the warm curve of his neck, his touch possessive and protective. "They will see a messy planet," 30 murmured, looking up at her, his expression warm and intimate. "A noisy, volatile, emotional planet. And they will see a species that is not afraid to break every rule in the galaxy to save what they care about." Beatrice lowered herself onto his lap, straddling his thighs with a fluid, comfortable movement, her uniform fabric sliding against the soft knit of his shirt. "They will also see the scientist who taught the cosmos a lesson in humility," Beatrice whispered, leaning in, her breath warm against his ear. "The architect who saved their son not by following their rules but by defying them. And the man who taught me that true power is found in shared, passionate defiance." She pressed her chest against his, the movement deliberate and sensual. The intense, deep-core connection they had forged in the Anvil had only deepened in the months of shared political battle. 30's pale eyes darkened, burning with the familiar, immediate fire she knew so well. He gripped her hips tightly, drawing her closer until there was no space left between them. "You were meant to be a diplomat, Beatrice," 30 said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But you are a revolutionary." "And you were meant to be a recluse, 30, she countered, her hand slipping beneath his shirt, exploring the muscular, defined warmth of his abdomen. "But you are a conqueror." She leaned her head back slightly, challenging him with her gaze. So, Conqueror, what is the next great thing you plan to build? Another sun? A fleet? 30 shifted her weight, maneuvering them both so he could pull her tightly against his body, their privacy absolute in the silent, star-flung cabin. The next great thing I plan to build is not a star, Commander, 30 whispered, his voice dark with intent, his touch moving to the sensitive curve of her back. It's a future where human integrity is the only law and where the only protocol I adhere to is the language of your body. He rose, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. The data slate fell harmlessly to the floor, forgotten. The window, now filled with the silent, vast expanse of the cosmos, was the perfect backdrop for their final, intimate, and triumphant moment. The Galactic Council had mocked humanity. But here, in the quiet heart of their own domain, the human scientist and the human diplomat had rebuilt not just a sun, but the foundation for human ascendancy, sealed with an enduring, passionate bond.